Hello, we are back today to talk a little bit about chord progression. So we talked about chord inversions last time, and now we're going to talk about how we can use those inversions to create chord progressions that sound good. You can create chord progressions just by jumping around the piano and using only root position chords, for example. And that sounds fine, but in classical music in particular, it's much more common to do that same thing instead of jumping, using inversions to basically kind of stay as close as possible to where you are. So instead of playing this, you would go, and that way you're staying pretty close to home and you're not having to jump around the keyboard as much. It often sounds better as well. I'll give you a couple more examples. So instead of going, you could go, so both might have their merits. The jumping around with the roots on the bottom is much more common in pop music, and then the inversions is much more common in classical. Jazz definitely uses inversions as well, so it's useful to learn these for jazz playing. So what we're going to do is look at just the C major scale in Classier Maestro. And we're going to explore all of the different chords that we can find within just the scale of C major, and then we're going to create some different chord progressions in the key of C, and from there we are going to invert those chords. So first we're going to go over the chords of C, and then we're going to create a progression, and then we're going to invert them. So the chords in the scale of C always have to have all white notes because the key of C only has white notes, no blacks. And we can build a chord starting on any note in the scale. So if we play a chord starting on C, that is our one chord. Now, if you don't know how Roman numerals work, stay tuned for a different video on the basics of different Roman numerals in music. So this is our one chord, or I, in Roman numerals because it starts on the first note of the scale. The second note of the scale is D, and if we play the chord starting on D with all whites, that is our two chord, or II, in Roman numerals. Notice that it's lowercase two I's because that indicates that it's a minor chord. The C was major, so uppercase. The 2 is minor, so lowercase. The third note in the scale of C is E, and if we build a chord off of E, that's going to be our 3 chord, or I. Again, minor, so lowercase. Fourth note, F. The chord is our 4 chord, or IV, Roman numerals. This one is major, so uppercase. Fifth note, G. G chord is our 5 chord, or V in Roman numerals, and that is uppercase. A chord, that is our 6 chord, or a VI, lowercase, also minor. And now we reach our funny guy, starting on B, our 7th note. And that is neither major nor minor. In fact, it's diminished, and you can tell by that little weird circle following it. Minor chord, as you might remember, would have the sharp, but we're not allowed to have the sharp in the key of C, so it's all white, and it sounds quite clashy. We don't use it that often, except when we combine it with the 5 chord. Now this is important for later. So often we combine the 5 chord and the 7th chord to create a 5-7 chord, and that's what that looks like right there. A very common chord, especially in classical music, but it's also used a ton in blues. So you'll hear it, something like, this would be more classical. And then maybe something more in the blues style, you'll have something like. So they can definitely create some different colors for sure in your music. All right, so now that we've discussed all of the possible chords in the scale of C, now it's time to pick and choose which ones we would like to use to create a progression. So I'm going to go to my whiteboard for this, and I'm actually going to kind of rewrite what we just saw using letters. So we have B, C. So I'm just writing out the scale of C. I'm going to space that out a bit more. Oops. Oh no, sorry. starting again. C, F, G, A, B, C. Here we go. Okay, so C was major, D is minor, E is minor, A is minor, and B is diminished. All right, so I'm going to write that now with regular numbers for those of you who are less familiar with Roman numerals. So the chords are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 1. So back to where we started. Now that's pretty obvious because you're just going up the scale and numbering each one as you go. But now with Roman numerals, we would label them like this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and back to 1. And then I just need to draw a little circle there for the diminished. Okay, so those are all of our colors, you might say, in the key. Just like the color wheel, there are 3 primary colors or chords that we rely on the most when we're creating music. The 1, the 4, and the 5. We also have 3 secondary colors that we rely on more often for just adding some contrast and again some additional color. And then the 7th, as I mentioned, often used in combination with the 5 or as a substitution for 5, as you'll find out if you study music in more depth. So to summarize, our primary chords are 1, 4, and 5, and our secondary chords are 2, 3, and 6. Ooh, when I write that out, you might notice something. These are all in uppercase and these are all in lowercase. The reason for that, as we talked about earlier, these are all majors and these are all minors. So the primaries are all major and the secondaries are all minor. So an easy way to remember which ones are which. Now, when we learn our primary chord progression, when we are studying piano, it's in a lot of methods. I teach Piano Safari, so it's in that one, but it's also found in Alfred and Weber as well. They'll have slightly different variations on them, but they'll have the same 3 basic chords in basically the same order. Okay, so here is the primary chord progression that you will encounter if you study piano for long enough. Primary chord progression, also known as kind of as extended cadence, but it's larger than a cadence. So it's going to go 1, 4, and then 5 or 5, 7, and then often back to 1. Now, in my particular method, they add a few extras in there for fun. So we have a 1, 4, 1, so we just return to 1, and then we go to the 5 before we go to the 5, 7, and then we return to 1. So we've just kind of added some extra filler in there. And the reason for that is that in music, we always have the sense of home and away. So looking at this progression right here, this part, 1, 4, 1, so that's the C, F, C chords, that kind of establishes that feeling of home. And then the next part here, the 5, 5, 7, you can tell if I linger on that, it's quite clashing. It definitely does not sound settling. It sounds quite dissonant, and you definitely want to move on from that. So it's home, away, and then home again. So if you hear it, you'll be able to tell the different sections. So 1, 4, 1. Sorry about that. And then 5, 5, 7, away, back to home. I'll play that once more because I was interrupted. 1, 4, 1, 5, 5, 7, 1. All right, so that is the chord progression that we are going to use today, that we're going to study. So again, it only uses the primary chords. We could definitely involve the secondary chords if we wanted to, but for the sake of just using what is probably the most common one, we're just going to stick with this. So I'm going to erase everything else except this, And now we're going to talk a little bit about chord inversions and how they can help us play this with greater ease. So if I stop the share and I go to Classroom Maestro again, so I'm going to play that chord progression only using root position chords. 1, 4, 1, 5, 5, 7, 1. That is a lot of jumping and it does not sound particularly good. So instead, we're going to start in root position, but then we're going to utilize some different inversions so that way we don't have to jump around quite so much. So back to the whiteboard. Okay, so our first chord is the 1 chord, also known as C, because we are in the key of C as we've mentioned. So I'm going to rewrite this progression down below here, and I'm also going to write in, the letters for you. 1, 5, 5, 7, 1. C, so 4 in the key of C is F. You can count up if you forget. Back to C. The 5th note is G, 1 up from F. And then the 5, 7 is going to be a G7 chord, a G chord with an extra note added at the top. And back to C. All right, so now we're going to fill in the letters. So a C chord in root position goes C at the bottom, and then E, and then G. So that is our C chord in root position. And I would like to just quickly circle the C because that way we can identify it as the root note. Okay, so our F chord normally would go F, A, C. I'll bump that up. However, like we said, that jumps around a lot. So what we end up doing is we look at any common notes between the 2 chords. Notice that they both have a C. So what we do is we take that C at the top of the chord, get rid of it, and bump it to the bottom. Now that is a common note between the 2 chords. And once we have that common note, we don't have to move much. So if I play from there to there, all that's happened is the G has gone up to A and the E has gone to F, and the C has stayed the same. All right, so now we are ready for our next C chord. Again, C is at the bottom. We don't want to move unless we have to. Next chord, G chord. So a G chord, B, D, move that up again. A G chord, again, if we go from, lots of interruptions today. We go from the C to the G, again, big jump, we want to avoid that. Are there any common notes between the C chord and the G? Yes, there are, the G chord. So I'm going to get rid of that G, and I'm going to put it at the top this time. So now my root is actually at the top. And I just realized, and you probably realized too, I made an error earlier. I circled the C as being the root note, but it was not. It's an F chord, so the F is the root. The C is at the bottom, but the F is the root. Sorry for the confusion there. And then our last chord here is the G7. So a G7 normally has 4 notes total. G, B, D, and F. Now, we sometimes play all 4 of those notes, but a lot of times we end up finding it's a bit murky, hard to play, it's a bit of an extra stretch. We end up getting rid of the D because it does change the sound, maybe a whisker, but not really, not in a way that's really going to affect our sound much. So that makes it a bit easier to play. Also, if we take that G from the bottom again and we bump it up to the top, that also makes it a lot easier to play because now all that we've done between the G and the G7 is we've substituted the D in the middle for the F. And then when we return home to C, we just go back to our root position chord. Because again, that G gets to stay constant. So there is our root. So I just want to emphasize those common tones are really why we rearrange these chords in such a way. It makes it so much easier to play. So there's the common tone there, common tone there, common tone, common tone, common tone. So these are the ones that stay put while the other notes move. So I hope this helps you kind of understand how we end up with our primary chord progression, and stay tuned for some more videos on chords and inversions.